From the personal diary of Annabelle McGregor, 7th of January 1932. Garrus came home today. He seemed paler than he used to be, and much more quiet. I wish there was something I could do. I wish I could bring him back to us. But he's gone. I have to accept that. We all have to. As it turns out, the diary of Annabelle McGregor, Garrus Creeley's abducted mother, for those of you who don't remember, was used in the writing of a 1998 psychological thesis by Catherine Jacobs, entitled From Garrus to Hannah, a study as to the effects of child molestation. In the book, the author uses materials from various different child molestation trials to form an in-depth study on the resulting mental scars such as experiences can produce in children. Annabelle's diary entries themselves aren't that relevant, often repeating the same things over and over, but they do form a cohesive thread between two big events in Garrus Creeley's life: his release from the West Riding Mental Hospital and his journey back to America. According to Annabelle McGregor, 19-year-old, Garrus Creeley left his parents for a week after returning to them, going off to work in a shoe factory. After being fired for his inability to follow proper safety instructions, he worked as an assistant ballet instructor in London. 6 weeks after this, he returned to his parents, where he learned that they had been harboring a secret from him. After Sheridan, his previous adoptive father, had died, Garrus was left to inherit all of his belongings. This included the expansive novel, Puppets, and the script and score for Puppetmaster, the musical version of the same novel. From the personal diary of Annabelle McGregor, 18 September 1932, Garrus called to tell us he was leaving. We asked when he was coming home. He hung up after that. It's been 4 days and I'm beginning to believe that I won't see him ever again. Not much is known about Garrus Creeley after that. The next existing record of him is in a financial statement in 1933 concerning an inquiry for a choreographer to work on the Puppetmaster's regime. It would appear that Garrus was continuing his adoptive father's work. Why on earth Garrus Creeley would drop everything in his life to continue the work of his childhood rapist is beyond all logical comprehension. One reason could be that he wanted to understand his father more. He was, after all, Sheridan's son. Perhaps he understood how much Puppetmaster had meant to him, so had devoted himself to polishing up the production. In Catherine Jacobs' book, she details a great many examples of this. In the letter from Garrus to the aforementioned choreographer, he writes, "I hope to enliven the production with a bit of playful mystery, to mirror the essence of the original novel format. I don't have the complete manuscript for Puppets, though Catherine Jacobs apparently does own a small snippet of about 200 pages. God only knows how she acquired this." She lists a total of 17 excerpts in her book. From what I've read, the prose of Puppets is very difficult to follow. One might assume that Sheridan hadn't ever revisited or stopped writing it. The story itself follows the main character, Moritor Abincis, as he goes off on an adventure to explore his own sexual agenda upon the request of a puppet that he meets in a dream. To get a feel for the odd, flowery nature of the writing, here's an excerpt. The puppet was as black as night upon the cold winter eyes of Lamastide, light and airy, yet weak and bitterly sharp. Upon sensing the figure's wooden presence, he scattered himself about the room, unable to find a proper door or window to relieve his urge to escape the angry monstrosity. His eyes danced along the riverway of contempt, stealing glances of the form that beckoned for him to remain motionless. Defeated, he rested himself within his own terror, bending as he slipped into remorse and fear. I have nothing to work with but the vague points provided by Miss Jacobs for this assumption, but I gathered that Garrus used his inheritance to fund the production of the Puppetmaster's regime. In the box 34 Creeley Wright, I found a small folder full of production notes from Garrus that I had glossed over in my previous search. Nothing of great importance stands out, other than the pitch Creeley used to attract the attraction of several theater owners who were interested in housing the production. In it, Garrus describes the show as upbeat, fraught with flowery production numbers, and a moral all ages can relate to. I feel like this is a good time to bring up my meeting with Miss Alice Corley James. I made sure to phone her grandchildren for permission to visit, for which I was declined 3 times. After I sent a cake, they understood my persistence, and I was granted access. It was a 6-hour drive to the home of Alice Corley James. Her granddaughter was hospitable enough. Well, as hospitable as someone can be when they obviously don't want you in their house. She took me to the living room and offered me some of the cake, which I declined. A few minutes later, I met Alice, who limped her way onto the couch with a plate in hand. I spoke to her, but she refused to converse until she had finished eating. I took an instant liking to the old bat, nutty as she was. Throughout the following Q&A, Alice made it very apparent that she had reviewed her facts. They seemed rehearsed and tired coming from her lips, but I didn't think much of it. How old were you when you saw the Puppetmaster's regime? 9. I had just turned 9 that Wednesday, and we were going to have a party the following Saturday. What do you remember about the production? I don't truly remember a lot about the show. I was young, I was hyperactive, and I was bored. Bored to tear by the entire thing. It was so very monotonous and so blandly staged. I recall watching the 3 kitties dancing the exact same motion, twist tap, for almost 4 minutes, all while the ensemble walked in crisp lines. It was so awkward. That little boy playing the main character, Maury something or other, was a bit quiet if you asked me. He sort of mumble-spoke, squinting the entire show. Those vague, squinty eyes were a bland too. I fell asleep halfway through Act 1. And do you remember the end of Act 1? No. When I woke up, my parents were dragging me out of the theater. I spent the next 3 hours waiting by the street with my mother while my father searched for his brother. Uncle Devin was the assistant choreographer, you see. He died backstage. I think a lift collapsed. I don't know. It was only when I was 30 did they actually tell me what happened, though I remember they never acted the same again. Did your uncle keep any documentation of his time working on the production? I wouldn't know. We weren't all that close to him, you see. If he did, where could I find those documents? Either they're still at the theater, or my father... Oh yes, my father probably had them. I remember the policeman delivering that box to us. Your best chance of finding it would be in the attic. We moved all my father's old office documents into a red... Yes, it was a red chest. If it isn't in there, it was most likely thrown away. Mrs. James' granddaughter aided me in my search, and together we found the red chest, as well as Devin Corley's belongings. They had been shoved into a small storage crate within the chest, sloppily strewn between wrinkled chunks of paper. I offered Alice the opportunity to rifle through the crate, but she politely shooed me out of her house before asking for another piece of cake. At first, I couldn't make much sense of the contents within the box. There were a few bills, some blasé production notes, and a list of ensemble performers. However, one particular sheet of paper did catch my interest: the audition notes for the role of Mortor. For those of you who don't remember, this was the character whose actor was last seen begging the audience to help him on the night of the Puppetmaster's premiere. Not many names are found in this file, oddly enough, just 14 boys and 6 girls. Underneath the various names are notes on the additions, writing such as too cheeky, too quiet, and too mumble-mouthed. But about 3/4 into the paper, the name Timmy Wright is circled 3 times, a small star etched beside it. He's the one. The note reads, boldly, I've done a bit of research on this performer. Timothy Cartwright was born August 16, 1923. His father, Vincent Cartwright, was a lighting designer for the theater on Broadway at the time. His wife, Margie, was a costume designer. Though little is known about the beginning of Timothy's career, by the age of 9 he had taken the vaudeville world by storm as Timmy Cutie Pie Wright, or Cutie Wright for short. As far as I can gather, that his only Broadway credit before the Puppetmaster's regime was in a semi-successful flop called Joyful Hooligans, in which he played a young British boy who falls off of a ship and is taken in by a band of American teenage pickpockets. Devin Corley's diary details the arrival of Timmy to the theater. He says that Timmy was asked to be dropped off in the lobby without his parents. Garrus Creeley instructed the staff not to enter the lobby for an hour. At the end of this hour, Garrus Creeley himself came to the lobby doors and found Timmy still in his seat by the receptionist's desk. He was quoted to have looked confused and scared, with a look in his eyes likened to an old cat, weak and defenseless. Garrus led him back to the office, where he waited for his parents to return to sign the proper paperwork. The next few entries of Devin Corley's diary describe the hiring of the rest of the cast and crew. Shirley Taxum was signed on to play Trahant for 3 weeks, then died in an automobile accident and was replaced by Sally Wilkes. Henry Gregory, another vaudeville performer who had worked with Timmy at least twice before, was signed on to play Adolbit. Other cast members included Fernando Perron as Mr. Obsessor and Grace Day as Madame Reperio. The casting for the Man in Black, as well as the puppet dressed in black, are not listed. The set design was done by Abraham Duarte, and costumes were done by Juliana White. Lighting and direction was taken up by Garrus Creeley himself. For the first 2 weeks of production, Devin Corley's description of Creeley doesn't seem too interesting. He was apparently a bit eccentric and a bit of a perfectionist, but also described as jolly and surreal, like those Santa impersonators you see at department stores. He was always cracking jokes and, for the most part, had a good attitude. However, as innocent as his behavior seemed, even from the beginning, he had a strange obsession with Timothy Wright. Corley details an instance where Timmy was clearly getting the choreography wrong, and yet, Garrus berated the other children for supposedly messing Timmy up. From Devin Corley's perspective, he coddles the boy and barely even directs him. Now, as lighthearted as he was, Garrus Creeley was also a rather strict director. Devin Corley claims that each of the cast members were instructed to arrive at 4 in the morning, 2 hours before the crew, simply for vocal exercises and warm-ups. One entry states the ensemble was placed into 3 lines, and the children were lined up in front. Mr. Creeley would spend 15 minutes going over the exact same tap dance routine each morning. He always had Timmy do it first, and then the others were to follow. Afterwards, everyone was to gather in a circle for vocal warm-ups. Garrus would start by going through the ranges, and then he had us do that awful dance. There were to be 2 circles, one inside the other, and the cast would hold hands. Then both circles were to dance around in opposite directions. The outer circle began to chant first, crying out, "Sementel, Sementel," while the inner circle yelled out, "Fraela, Fraela." Both chants were ensemble lyrics that had been cut out of the production, but Mr. Creeley saw fit to include them every morning, saying they were perfect vocal exercises. Garrus' impatience continued throughout the rehearsals. He grew violent, and many cast members reported to Devin that Sally Wilkes exhibited bruises on her upper arms. The script was modified weekly, putting the company under great stress. Timmy Wright was the one who took the most damage, as most of the changes gave his character more lines, placing a lot of pressure on him. He was often asked to visit Creeley's office for private readings, where he'd stay for hours. Tragedy entered the life of Timothy Cartwright on August 13, 1933, when he and his family were the victims of an automobile accident which killed his father and severely injured both he and his mother. Devin writes that for a month and a half, Garrus visited Timmy daily, and eventually stopped coming to rehearsals altogether. The principal choreographer, Mandis Thorman, took up the role of director during that time. It was also at this point that they sought out the employment of 14-year-old Rory Atkins to be the understudy for Timmy. Devin writes that it was at the conspiring of Thorman and the producers that Rory would eventually replace Timmy. This cutie Wright, writes one producer, is completely inept at the art of performance. His delivery is too big, his eyes are too big, his presence is too big, and for all that bigness, he has shocking little amount of talent and discipline. Mr. Creeley spoils the boy and hardly gives a scrap of motivational honesty in the direction of anyone else. In short, Timothy Cartwright must go. While Garrus was gone, the production staff also persisted in cutting certain things from the show. This included a number that occurred midway through Act 2, a gibberish song sang by an army of puppets that was said to have slowed down the production. Creeley was quite unhappy with this, making several angry phone calls about the matter. They eventually gave him an ultimatum: cut the number completely or put it somewhere else. Garrus placed it at the end of Act 1. Devin notes that Garrus would tell the children to practice this number in their own time, and when they did run through it during rehearsals, it was in segments, never in its entirety. The number itself contained one group of lyrics that was repeated over and over again. Garrus made it painfully clear that the company was to sing these stanzas exactly 100 times before they could take a break during intermission, even if the curtains closed before they were finished. Devin's journal ends with a relief from the notes throughout. Instead, he explains an event that he himself was present for. I think it's best to simply present the section as it was written. Nobody was ever allowed in Mr. Creeley's office but Mr. Creeley and Timmy. I assumed Mr. Creeley would want to meet Rory, but he never asked for an audience with him. Mandis had instructed me to deliver 3 resignation letters to Mr. Creeley's desk. When I entered his room, it was all musty and hot, like there wasn't even air conditioning in there. The curtains were drawn, but my vision adapted fairly quickly. I saw that on the floor was a worn mattress with plates and cups all around. I blinked in surprise. Rushing over to the bedding, I noticed it had definitely been in use for quite a while. I wondered in astonishment if Mr. Creeley had been living in the theater. When I considered the idea, I did recall that he'd put all of his money into this show, and we never heard him ask us to send papers to his house, only to his office. Along the far end of the room were a few piles of shirts and trousers. It was still very dark, so I didn't focus on them too much. I went to set the papers down on the desk when, against my better judgment, I had the urge to snoop around a bit. I looked over the top of the desk, which had nothing but pans and scrambled folders, then went right for the center drawer. What was inside it frightens me more now than it did at the time. Within the drawer was a gun, a bit eccentric maybe, but I thought nothing of it, as well as a worn hand-painted mask. Red in color, it was put into the shape of a doll's face. A puppet's. Beside the mask was a small journal. I opened it and found the pages to be yellowed with age. They concealed mad writings that were barely legible, but I could tell by the drawings that it was some sort of worshipper's guide. There were these charcoal sketches of a puppet, a giant puppet that controlled the world on strings protruding from its fingernails. Other pictures showed the puppet walking amongst common men who could not see it. There was a drawing of a man, a small girl, the puppet controlling his arms. There was a man stroking the bodies of his wife and children, a young girl being bought for the night by an older gentleman, 2 twins being held down on their bed by some invisible force, all pictures in which the puppet stood by, grinning. I placed the journal back into the drawer, but then I noticed the mask. It had the same face as the puppet as well as an insane grin, wide eyes, puffy cheeks. It was only when I held it closer to my face that I noticed that it also shared the features of Timmy, the same mouth, the same nose, and the same eyes. I shoved the mask back into the drawer and shut it quickly, my curiosity morphing into sickness. I backed away from the desk and hit the wall. Turning to my right, my foot came into contact with the pile of clothes I saw earlier. My eyes had completely adjusted to the dark by now, and I could see that not all of the shirts and trousers were in Mr. Creeley's size. At least 4 of them were smaller, the kinds of clothes a young boy would wear. I grabbed the papers off the desk and ran out, delivering them into Mr. Creeley's hand that afternoon. After that, there are 7 blank pages in the journal of Devin Corley, and no more entries. At the bottom of this crate, however, was a newspaper dated October 3rd, 1935. The headline read, "Flower Shop Vandal Strikes Again," and on the 3rd page is a small section dedicated to the disaster that occurred at the August Wilson Theater on October 1st. Oddly enough, the article doesn't mention the Puppetmaster's regime by a name more than once, but it focuses on the aftermath. In an interview with police officer Jamie Winthrop, "We ain't got no idea what could have happened. We got a call from a diner down the street talking about some riot going down at the August Wilson. We come down to find a bunch of theatergoers crying and begging for help. They just kept saying, 'They're dead, they're dead, they're really dead.' We went inside, but we didn't find nothing." You see, 76 attendants of that 1935 showing went missing, 98 if you count the theater company. Their bodies were never recovered from the stage, though many testified to have seen them die. Others claimed to have watched people collapse in the aisles. When police investigated the theater, they saw that one of the lifts backstage had collapsed, but there were no traces of anyone there. The only body recovered was that of Garris Creeley. He had been found in his office with a bullet to his head. Other than that, nothing. No blood, no struggle. Those 98 people were never seen again. After that, there's nothing left in the crate but barely visible photos of cast members and fabric samples for costumes. At this point, my investigation into the Puppetmaster's regime ended. Or at least, the historical investigation. Do you remember the revival of the play I mentioned in my first post? Well, the first preview performance will take place in Chicago on September 18th, and I've already booked balcony seats. Being a full-time investigator for an obscure pornographic musical doesn't lend itself to much of an earning, you see. I will be attending this showing, where I will record the audio and take notes on the production. I'll do a detailed run-through of it the day afterwards. Investigation will resume on September 18th. Alright, I never got around to posting the previous investigation. I know, it was irresponsible, but during my wait for Puppetmaster, I started actually paying attention to my college courses, and I never really had time to revise my first draft, so I suppose I would just have to post my findings in one long entry. I have seen the revival of Puppetmaster. The experience was odd. It's hard to remember the things that went wrong unless I run through the entire thing in my head. It's easier to write about the first act in that way, I guess. I know that doesn't really make sense when you put it to words, but it's hard to explain. But enough of my cryptic build-up. I arrived in Chicago last week, where I stayed with a couple of old high school friends for a few days. We had fun catching up, but I never took my mind off the Puppetmaster's regime. The theater that housed the production was rather obscure, located a few miles out from the main city. None of the news articles I've read post-preview have mentioned the name of the theater, so I can only imagine they didn't want the publicity. Upon entering the theater, I was given a playbill by a cheery man in a suit, an older gentleman with a weak smile on his face. It showed the white silhouette of a young boy with several puppet strings attached to a scribbly red and black heart that hung within his chest. There were white dollies dangling all around him. I remember thinking it was odd that our preview playbill would be in color, as those aren't usually printed until the show starts making money. Anyhow, I made it to my seat and began to read through the playbill itself. I didn't care much about the names of the cast members, though I do recall seeing the picture for the boy playing the part of Moritor, a 14-year-old named Milton Holiday. The show opened to a long, plodding overture performed mostly with the piano, with these odd whistles being played through the speakers all around the theater. After about 5 minutes, the music changed to a more bouncy, lighthearted tune, and the curtain came up. The stage was empty. There was nothing but the projected backdrop of a village square, with these odd clouds floating above. About 10 children in 18th century German clothing skipped on stage, playing with balloons and dolls. As the music progressed, a small mechanical horse wheeled itself on stage. The lights dimmed, and the children stopped. The horse dragged along a cart upon which a small curtained puppet box faced the audience. As the cart came to a stop, a large puppet in a black robe flew out from behind the curtain. The children screamed and backed away. Then the puppet spoke. "Hello, little ones. It's a wondrous day for a bout of play, isn't it? Now don't you be frightened, sweetlings. The puppet dressed in black has a tale to weave, and someone has to hear it. Why, even if a story isn't terribly uplifting, it's the relevance that matters, isn't it? Now gather, my popinjays. For this story, I'm afraid, requires the keen ears of a curious child. Only the innocent can see things simply, without the distraction of gross." The children looked at each other, then slowly began to gather around the cart. Once they were all seated, the puppet let out a chilling laugh. "That's the spirit, kiddies," he spoke. Now this is a story about many things, about love and hate, about dark and light, about the difference between right and wrong and the difference between wrong and right. But at the core, this is a story about a little boy named Moritor. And with that, the light on the cart faded away and was replaced by a small boy, holding a broom, smiling proudly. Moritor. The rest of the prologue is rather bland, and I can't remember or decipher the audio to much of the exposition. The puppet Moritor and Mr. Obsessor share a song. We learn that Moritor was an orphan who Mr. Obsessor found on the side of the street 5 years ago and has since put him to work in his puppet shop. The costumes from this point on seem much less historically accurate from the opening scene. Everyone's clothes are faded and bland, but each of the outfits are also ridiculously frilly and layered. Some of the story's exposition was changed. For example, Moritor's last name, Abensis, has been reapplied from the novel on which the story was based. The staging and set design was oddly reminiscent of Andrew Lloyd Webber's The Woman in White. Most of the sets were made up of hyper-realistic projections that gave the illusion of a moving camera. However, unlike The Woman in White, there were far more set pieces which actually had moving images projected onto them, like the revival of Sunday in the Park with George. For example, during one of the opening songs, I Can Hear Them Whisper, we see Moritor sweep up around the puppet shop. We watch as the front desk and 2 puppet display shelves spin around on a turntable as the projected background spins slightly faster, adding in ominous shadows and subtle lighting changes. It was dizzying, but effective. Most of Act 1's exposition seemed rather harmless in my opinion. It almost felt like the start of a Disney show. However, I did find my inner critic rolling his eyes at some of the puerile lyrics, my personal favorites being, "He pretended he was crying, though they told me he was lying," and "He was a sickly boy, knowing not of joy." However, upon comparing the new version to what I've heard about the other two, there were some significant changes to the show. The character of Madame Reperio was cut completely after the QT song, Get a Puppet. We are taken to the center of the village. Here we have one of the songs that had been cut in previous versions entitled Whittle Time, in which the villagers celebrate a holiday of the same name. The celebration focuses on the townspeople dancing around with puppets and dolls made out of random objects like twigs, scraps of clothing, and corn stalks. The music is charming, like a folk song, although the lyrics don't seem to make much sense. Dancing as we pither through the withering and woe, evermore aligned along the ever-growing row, eyes without a trace of tones or livelihood, and so rise and rejoice for a Whittletine song, and the willows will wander all Whittletine long. Here the song where the children sell dolls is used as a bridge in the Whittletine sequence. Another change is the rearranging of The Wind and the Whisperings, a song that was originally played in Act 2. In this new version, it is sung so monotonously by a group of black-clad people mourning the loss of a young girl, a victim. The sequence itself is so strange. Around 8 people walk on stage, 4 of them carrying a small open coffin. The lighting goes from yellow-orange to blue, and the chorus drones on for about 8 minutes as they somewhat explain how this girl died. The wind was her muse for play, and she pranced along the river way. She slipped along the sides of the weeping willow's hair, and she danced along the river with a nary remorse. The whisperings from far away, calling out for her to stay. She stayed there with the wind and the whisperings of yore, and she danced with them until he saw fit to take her source. Again, this uncomfortable ensemble song goes on for about 8 minutes. From what I can assume, the little girl had been playing along the river when a man asked her to stay with him until nighttime, at which point he, her, and tried to drown her before a policeman stopped him, right as the girl perished. Other than that, most of Act 1 seemed the same as the other versions. There is a small section where a girl with a puppet mysteriously appears and disappears while Moritor sweeps up a shop, and a random scene right before the finale in which Mr. Obsessor sings about the hardships of raising Moritor, a song reworked from the same song Madame Reperio sang in 1934. The finale song, which so many people had claimed held some sort of force to it in the 1934 production, didn't seem all that powerful. Though this may have been due to a rewrite. The 1934 version was said to be significantly longer than the 1928 workshop, at around 12 minutes of non-stop gibberish lyrics. The modern version had a reprise of The Wind and the Whisperings, followed by a few verses told through the odd language. The lyrics are in fact somewhat odd sounding after 2 minutes of non-stop strobe lighting, but I wasn't that affected by it. There weren't any deaths after the finale at least. though intermission did last 10 minutes longer than it was supposed to due to technical difficulties backstage. Act 2 was where most of the changes seemed to be. It began with a light on Moritor being strung up on ropes like a puppet, his friends and Mr. Obsessor hanging on either side of him. A new number occurs where all the songs from Act 1 are placed into a montage while the Act 1 finale music plays in the background. Just as the music shifts to the pounding Whittleteen music, Moritor awakens. Remember when I mentioned that Act 2 was mostly made up of a bunch of songs played one after the other for no apparent reason? Most of that had been cut. The only two songs left from that long drawn out sequence were What Is This Place and Moritor's Soliloquy, which had been renamed to Moritor Confronts the Puppet and changed to a duet sequence. The lyrics had been improved as well, whereas the 1934 show had lyrics such as this: What is this place? What are you aiming? This isn't well, sir. Why are we gaming? This isn't a game. The improved lyrics are: What is this place? Wait, am I dreaming? This isn't real, no. Not what it's seeming. It's all a dream. Still a bit clunky, but at least they made sense now. The particular scenes I listed before involving a panicky Moritor confronting the puppet dressed in black, who explained that Moritor's soul once belonged to a child, and that he died before the puppet could punish him. This is where the set designs become a bit odd. There were several floor-to-ceiling metal dollies that would constantly roll about on stage, as if to symbolize Moritor walking somewhere. The backdrop went red, and there were projections of puppets flinging the corpses of children along the walls. To say it was unsettling would be an understatement. After this, the story progressed in a similar manner to the 1928 workshop, but with different twists. Moritor learned that the odd-looking man in black from the first act was the boy that Moritor in the past life. The man in black wished to revisit the relationship, but Moritor wanted nothing to do with him. They spent the next 10 minutes singing about what might have been, and Moritor began to remember things. He ended up seducing and dominating the man in black, then they had sex on a bed while a group of child acrobats frolicked about on long sheets of fabric above them. Just then, the puppet dressed in black showed up and ordered the old man to go away. He explained to Moritor that his punishment was to forever serve him, aiding in the future and murder of children in the village where he lived. As they both sang the title song, several children, including the little girl who drowned in Act 1, joined in, all holding miniature puppets dressed in black. The new ending is a bit confusing, but apparently they're saying that pedophilia is some sort of vicious cycle. When a pedophile dies, his soul is placed in a newborn child who will by fate be themselves. This influences them to become child molesters in their adulthood. Moritor, as well as several other children, managed to defy destiny by escaping their respective, which resulted in them being enlisted into the Puppetmaster's regime. It makes so little sense, and it's so damn creepy. Then, just like in the 1928 workshop, all of Moritor's friends were returned to the puppet shop, but none of them had any memory of Moritor. We cut back to the cart from the prologue where we saw that all of the children had disappeared. Behind the puppet box, Moritor and the man in black exited from behind the curtains. They hopped upon a horse and began to trot their way out of the town. As they left the village, they heard a small girl's terrified screams before she lunged out in front of the cart. She began to beg Moritor and his companion to help her, but just as an old man rushed out in pursuit, he insisted he was the girl's father, but she sobbed that she'd never met him before. Panicked, Moritor pulled on the horse's reins and ran over the man, killing him. The man in black turned to Moritor, and his voice low, and whispered, "Moritor, what have you done?" before the lights went out. However, right after this scene is where things quickly become wrong. The lights slowly faded from the green tint of the forest into a deep blue, similar to how things looked during the wind and the whisperings. The entire company slipped out from backstage holding their miniature puppets, staring directly at the audience. Just then, the lights began to flash and the puppets, I know this sounds kinda stupid to say, but they sang. I don't mean that children sang while controlling the puppet's mouth. The puppets actually sang, and oh god, the song. It was that same gibberish from the Act 1 finale. The children and the adults, all of them were holding puppets. They chanted those horrible words over and over again, their eyes unblinking, focused on the audience. Trapped in our seats, we were forced to listen to them repeat themselves over and over. I saw that the cast had begun to move the puppets around in jerking, near-erotic dance moves, every now and again twitching in unison with the rest of the company. After a while, I began to feel sick. We were all sick. I could see people in front of me leave their seats, ready to go. I tried tuning the chants out, but that only seemed to make them worse. The music pounded within me, causing me to jerk about with each pounding drum. As I leant back into my seat, I realized something. The pounding within me wasn't just from the orchestra, it was from beneath me. For a moment, I could see that everyone else had noticed it too. For a faint moment, we'd felt the ground beneath us quake along with the chants. I looked up to see if the cast had realized, but then I saw the puppets. They were still dancing and moving within the performer's grasp, but the performers themselves were not moving their arms. And then for a moment, we all found relief. From backstage, several crew members rushed onto the stage, pushing several actors away in the process. One of them screamed out, "Fire! Shit!" And then the chaos began. From above the stage, all the lights began to shoot off. The projections behind the actors flickered and then disappeared entirely. The company screamed, as did the audience. In a flash of fire and sparks, the actors began to leap off the stage, and we all began to pile out of the door. I still had a headache, and I could still hear the pounding. The fire department arrived shortly after the theater was evacuated. About 10 minutes before the trucks got there, we heard the back of the theater collapse. I have since checked the articles online, and over 60 attendants of that show, 9 of them being part of the cast and crew, have gone missing. As it turned out, most of the people who didn't leave the parking lot were either helping out, like me, or were too shaken up to drive. When I finally began walking towards my car, a gurney was wheeled right past me. The man I saw laying there, unconscious and hooked up to an oxygen tank, was the same man who handed me the playbill. I drove back to my friend's apartment and went straight to bed. Even in my sleep, I could still hear the pounding. By morning, my headache had stopped, but the memory of the night before lingered. I went to my computer straight away to upload the audio I had recorded. My camera tends to divide long videos into smaller ones, and I immediately deleted the last video. Nobody ever needed to hear that, especially not me. I listened to the recording again, making notes in a word processor as I went along. I found myself humming to some of the more bouncy tunes, the pounding slowly fading away. My fear of the show had lessened. The idea of supernatural forces destroying the theater seemed far too ridiculous for me to take seriously, so I brushed my fear aside. Once that was done, I went to work scanning the playbill. After doing the front, I got to work on the interior pages. Curious, I also ended up skimming through some of the production names. And it was then, right there on the third page, that I saw the picture of the man who had handed me the playbill. He was the head producer-director. I learned, a cheery older guy with a wrinkled face, looking away from the camera. Below his picture, in bold letters, read the name, Timothy Cartwright. My face scrunched, my breath went still. All I could hear was the faint memory of the pounding. That isn't right, I told myself. It couldn't be possible. It was a different person. It had to be. Timmy Wright died on October 1st, 1935. At the premiere of the Puppetmaster's regime, everyone saw it. Everyone saw him begging for help tied up in strings. This couldn't be real. Then I remembered something. In my interview with Alice Corley James, she mentioned Molitor's squinty eyes and his monotonous acting. Timmy Wright was known for his wide-eyed expressions and over-the-top delivery. It's what made him famous. The person performing Molitor that night in 1934 must have been Rory Atkins, the understudy. That and Garrett Creeley had been found dead, killed by a gunshot to the head. Everyone assumed it was suicide, nobody even suspected murder. I remember Devin's journal, the puppet mask, the clothes, the fascination Creeley had with little cutie Wright. Nobody even suspected murder, why would they? And then, to add to my revelation, I realized that among the cast members who had escaped from the theater, there was one boy sitting in the backseat of his mother's car. The vague, empty face of Milton Holiday. Molitor. The Puppetmaster's regime isn't a simple musical, I've come to realize. It's more than a production, it's a force. It's an entity, even. It's not only a madman's sick, elaborate scheme to his own son. It isn't just a young boy's obsession over destroying his father's work. It isn't an innocent victim's last attempt at showing the world how he was wrong. It's a greater monster than that. Within the writing and the music of this show is something. I don't know what, and I don't want to know what. My guess is some kind of monster that refuses to die. People who saw the Puppetmaster's regime in both 1928 and 1934 were said to have suffered from lifelong mental conditions, causing them to hum tunes they had heard only once. Even now as I type, I quietly hum the sick, demented tune of "Never Mind Me, Mister." When I sleep, the wind in the whisperings refuses to rid itself from my subconscious. I find myself thinking about this production day and night, about the depth of certain subplots and songs. What's worse is that I know that someday another revival of the demented work will make its way onto the stage. Milton Holiday is still alive, isn't he? And this evil won't rest until it remakes itself again. I've decided not to post any more of my findings. This includes the audio taken of the revival. I suggest that none of you attempt to look further into the matter. It simply isn't worth it. A few days after my previous update, I read some articles about the fire at the theater. Remember all those missing people? The fire department has been searching through the rubble. Not a single body has been found.